So, Professor Swinburne, you're talking about the case you try to set in Mind, Brain and Free Will, and you're particularly famous, I think, for your arguments to revitalize dualism, particularly substance dualism, which is the position that there is a body and a soul, and that mental events are not physical events. And you say in the first chapter of this Mind, Brain and Free Will that people, particularly scientists and philosophers, have effectively said that the mind is only the brain. Why can't the mind just be the brain?
Well, let's take it back a long way. We clearly have thoughts, we have feelings, we have desires, we have sensations. And each of us knows better than anybody else what our thoughts and feelings and sensations are. This is obvious from the fact you may learn about what is happening in my visual field, what are the patterns of light and colour in my visual field, or what thoughts are crossing my mind from how I behave. You think that if I'm looking at this, I'm probably having such and such patterns of visual in my visual field. And you might know enough about me to guess what I'm thinking about. But whatever evidence you can have about this, I can also have. I could, as it were, watch a film of my behaviour and make an inference from that about what I am supposed to be having by way of sensations. And I could watch a film of my behaviour over life and infer what sort of thoughts I'm having. So any way you can learn about my thoughts and feelings and sensations, I can learn. But I do have the further way. I actually have these and I experience them. So there are a whole class of events which I wish to call mental events. Now, that's just a matter of definition that I use this word. We could use the word in any way we like. But a mental event, in my terminology, is an event to which the subject has privileged access, and necessarily so. It wouldn't be a sensation if it was a public thing. And among mental events, there are what I call pure mental events, that is, ones which don't have any physical event as a part, a physical event being one to which there is public access. For example, seeing that book is a mental event because I can know best whether or not I'm seeing it, but if it's true that I'm seeing it, then there is a public part of this event, that is to say, the book itself is present, and therefore seeing the book is a mental event but not a pure mental event. But seeming to see the book or having such and such sensations are pure mental events because the claim that they're occurring doesn't entail, it isn't part of that claim, anything about the physical world. Now, so there are pure mental events and there are physical events, and if you define them in this way, there are obviously two classes of events going on in the world. Many other philosophers may have other definitions of mental or physical from which that doesn't follow. But I'm entitled to my own definitions, which are useful because they draw attention to the fact there are two classes of events. And I think anybody ought to see that. There are events to which we have privileged access and there are ones to which we don't. Though, of course, there are causal relations between them. That book, presence of the book and goings on in my brain, no doubt cause me to have certain visual sensations, and my intentions, to which I also have privileged access, cause me to wave my hand, but it's a separate going on. That's the first thing that needs to be established.
So you could say that if we were to somehow chart or collect all the data of all the events that take place among all the substances, you could have a collection of almost all of the events of the world's history, but you couldn't have all of them because there are some that are subjective to you.
Well, other people might know about them. I don't wish to know that, just to deny other people can have pretty justified beliefs about what I'm thinking about, but I can have even better justified beliefs, that's the point. And among the events of the world there are both physical events, that's to say ones to which there is public access, and ones which are non-physical, and I call them pure mental events, that is to say ones which the subject knows better. That's all I'm claiming. Necessarily knows better.
So particularly that term you use, public events.
Yeah.
there's going to be the case, no matter who's taking this data or who's making the measurement, that the only pure mental events are the ones that you're privy to, the ones I'm having right now, the ones you're having right now. Yeah. And I can't be sure that you're not the philosophical zombie, for instance. Is that?
That is correct, yes.
So I can't be sure that you're not just having these causes.
Reasonable belief that I'm not, but you can't be certain.
Yes. Because solipsism is a step further. But say I were to put a helmet on you, and it has all these electrodes, and it takes a PET or an EEG or an fMRI scan of your brain as you're thinking. Surely then I have material proof of you having mental events.
No, you don't. No, not necessarily. Not as good as I do. Because I could also have a look at what the machine says, and so that would too be a public event. But I am in a position to check whether the machine's got it right or not, and the machine isn't.
So that's how that argument goes. And from there, so you have these subjective experiences, these pure mental events that only you're privy to. How do you move from there to consciousness?
Well, some of these are events of which necessarily we're conscious, and others of them are ones of which we can become conscious. That's what makes them ones to which we have privileged access. And sensations, patterns of light in my visual field, or tastes that I'm having when I'm eating something, or pains. All of these are conscious events in the sense that unless I'm conscious they're occurring, they're not occurring. That is to say, a pain that I don't feel isn't a pain, and a thought that isn't crossing my mind isn't a thought. Others of these events, such as beliefs and desires, are ones which we have while we're not thinking about it, but we can bring them to our attention if we want to. I mean, clearly I have all sorts of beliefs about ancient history and so on, which I'm not thinking about now, but I have these beliefs because I can ask myself, what do I think about when Jesus was born, or whatever, and then I bring to consciousness a belief about this. So, the consciousness, pure mental events are either ones of which the subject is conscious or can become conscious.
Right, so these conscious events, how do we know they're not, or these consciousness as a general concept, how do we know that they're not just some undiscovered emergent properties, a sort of soul of the gaps argument?
Well, what do you mean by undiscovered emergent properties? They can't be physical events for the reasons I've given. They are what they are. To say they're emergent is to put forward a theory of how we come to have them. But it doesn't show what their nature is. Their nature is their, as you put it, subjectivity. Now, of course, I don't wish to deny that they are in general, not always, but in general, caused by my brain and cause events in my brain. Sure, they're in causal interaction, but there's a separate thing in separate events which are in causal interaction with brain events. Given my definition of event identity, they are different events. And the crucial point about my definition of event identity is you should count as a separate event anything which you would have to list if you were to tell the whole history of the world. Now, if my being in pain was the same event as some going on in my brain, my C fibers firing, then you wouldn't need to list it as a separate event in the catalogue of events in the world. So all you would have to say, if you were telling the history of the world, was that my C fibers were firing. But if you did that, there would be things going on in the world which, rather important things, which you wouldn't have listed. You've got to list as separate things events which don't entail two events as separate events if the description of their occurrence, the occurrence of one, doesn't entail, it isn't part of, the description of the occurrence of the other, and conversely. And that is clearly so with all the pure mental events which I've mentioned. To have a pain doesn't entail, it's not part of the meaning of it, that this, that, or the other goes on in the brain. Indeed, you can see that by the fact scientists can't find out what the brain correlate of me being in pain is just by reflecting on the meaning of being in pain. They've got to look, and to look is to find a separate event which is in interaction with being in pain.
Of course, when they say that you're experiencing certain symptoms that indicate pain, they're using an analogy of their own pain, their own familiarity with pain, to understand yours, but they don't understand your exact pain.
That is correct, yes. We can know what we mean by pain. They can know to some large extent what they mean by pain by the fact that it's the going on which is caused by sticking needles into me, or which is evidenced by my screaming out or something. But it's not obvious that that's the same in every individual in any way, and there's no way of testing that it is. And indeed, there are people who don't feel pain. They are. It's a tragedy for them, because they don't realize when there's something wrong with their body and so on. But since human brains are in various ways different from each other, it wouldn't be surprising if what constitutes one person's pain isn't quite the same as what constitutes another person's pain.
You said something quite interesting earlier about how the mind is, how the experiences of the mind are caused by causal events from the brain. So if we say that consciousness indicates that there is a soul, where do we find this soul? What if we cut a brain in half? And does the soul have any effect on the brain?
Well, I want to argue, and you haven't asked me for my grounds for this, but I want to argue that the pure mental events are states of my soul, and the brain events are states of my body. And where is the soul? Well, it's an immaterial thing, and therefore you have to make it a matter of definition where the immaterial thing is. And it's natural to say that, well, the immaterial thing is where its immediate effects and its immediate causes are. But just because it's immaterial, you don't see it. Or you could say that just because it doesn't, as it were, occupy space, it doesn't exclude any matter from space, that it isn't anywhere. You have to define what it is for an immaterial, or I think I'd rather say non-physical thing to exist, to be, or what it is for it to occupy one place rather than another place. And I say there are these alternative definitions. You can say that it is where its immediate causes and effects are, which will give you the answer, it's in my brain. Or you can say that it only exists in a place if it excludes matter and other physical objects from it. And since it doesn't, then it's not anywhere.
So if we allow, again, for these explanations to indicate that there is a soul, and it may well do quite convincingly for some, how do we establish free will, as you say you do in your latest book?
Yes. Well, there are two stages of this. The doctrine of free will I'm concerned with is the view that we sometimes make choices which we are not fully caused to make. That is to say that no brain event makes us choose this rather than that. I don't think all our choices are free, because we always do what we see is the best action to do unless we feel any desire not to do it. And we always do what we desire unless we feel it's not a good thing that we should. So, as it were, we are largely influenced by desire and reason. Reason telling us what's good, and desire inclining us to do something. So it's only when either the two alternative actions are ones which we think are equally good and equally desire to do, in that case we have a choice, or they are ones, and these are the important ones, where we think one action's the best but we desire to do something else, and that's the situation where we are tempted, and there too we make a choice. Now in those two kinds of case, I wish to argue that there is no brain event or any other event which causes us to make those choices. Now, there are two stages in this. If there were such a brain event, then there's two kinds of determinism. Determinism being the doctrine that every event has a full cause. There are two kinds of determinism under which we wouldn't have any free will. The first is physical determinism. Now, the physical determinist says every event is caused by a brain event. There aren't every event is caused by a physical event, and therefore every mental event is caused by a brain event. Now, there's the doctrine, but we shouldn't believe a big doctrine like this unless we've got evidence for it. What sort of evidence could we have? Well, we could find out that whenever anybody had a mental event, that made no difference to any of their brain events. That's to say that because if it did make a difference to their brain events, then these brain events wouldn't be caused solely by brain events. They wouldn't be, physical determinism wouldn't hold. Physical determinism involves ruling out anything in the physical world being caused by anything not in the physical world. And a lot of modern neuroscientific work in the past 20 years has been designed to show that our intentions, that is to say the purposes which we try to manifest, are not caused by any mental events. They are just caused by goings on in the brain. And we only think that the intentions we form make any difference to what we do. But that program, my argument in this book, is self-defeating, because you can only show that our intentions don't make any difference to what we do if you can set up a program which says, well, these brain events occur, and whether or not we have an intention, it doesn't make any difference to which brain events occur. But in order to prove that, you've got to show that on many occasions, when we had an intention, that didn't make a difference. But then you have to know when subjects have an intention. The only way you can know when subjects have an intention is because they tell you they have an intention. And if they tell you they have an intention, the only reason to believe them would be to believe that their belief that they had an intention and their intention to tell you the truth made a difference to what they say. And therefore, the whole program is self-defeating. The only way we can have evidence for it is if we believe it false. Have you followed?
Yeah, I do.
And therefore, it's self-defeating. So I think any form of physical determinism is self-defeating. So if there was to be a determinism by which our intentions are determined, it would have to be what I would call a psychophysical determinism. That is to say, the true theory would have to say such and such brain events cause such and such mental events, and such mental events cause such and such brain events. Okay, that allows the downward causation from the mental to the physical, but it claims the mental itself has caused it. Now, if you're going to have a theory like that, there are enormous difficulties in having such a theory, which you could in any way test. You would have to have laws of the form, whenever the brain is in such and such a condition, then someone has a belief of that kind. Whenever the brain is in such and such a different condition, someone has a pain. Whenever the brain is in this third condition, someone has the thought crossing their mind that it's thirsty, and so on. Now, the trouble is that people have different systems of concepts. What you mean by a table isn't quite the same as what I mean by a table, although it's largely the same, so that's why we can communicate. And likewise, your brain isn't quite the same as my brain. It's got the same bits, cerebellum and the two halves, and it's got the hippocampus and the amygdala and all sorts of bits. But the way these are connected is different in different people. So, any theory you could establish, if you were to establish that some going on in my brain produced such and such, couldn't possibly be tested by looking at other people whether this happened there, because their brains are a bit different and their beliefs are a bit different. And likewise, we can have innumerably different beliefs and thoughts and sensations which can't be analyzed in terms of other beliefs, thoughts and sensations. Now, what's characteristic of the physical world, of the laws which govern it, is there are, in the end, only a few sorts of quantities which interact to produce other sorts of quantities. You can analyze goings on in the physical world in terms of the mass of particles, in terms of the charge on the particles, in terms of the distance between the particles, and a few, half a dozen other things that physicists have discovered, like the color charge and the spin and so on. But there's only a few of these things, and consequently you can have an equation relating, just to take a simple example of the conservation of momentum, relating the mass and velocity of two bodies which collide to the mass and velocity of those bodies subsequently. You can have equations governing these quantities, but the trouble with any psychophysical theory is there would be innumerable different beliefs which couldn't be analyzed in terms of other beliefs. Just think of a dictionary. Most of the words in the dictionary can't be fully defined in terms of other words in the dictionary. And likewise, we have all sorts of different ways of putting the words together into sentences. And that needs a whole grammar of a language. So instead of having a few simple laws, in order to just describe the psychophysical interactions in one individual, you would have to have an enormous number of laws governing that individual, as many as could be captured in the grammar of a language and the dictionary of a language. And that's a lot. Furthermore, you have this problem of access, especially in regard to sensations. That is to say, there's no way of finding out whether my sensation is the same as your sensation of pain, etc. So, enormous difficulty in getting the data. The data we had would be different for different people, and so the possibility of a set of laws governing this, there would be, I won't say an infinite set, but for each individual there would be millions, trillions of separate laws, which therefore could only be tested on one or two occasions. And this suggests an almost insuperable practical difficulty of testing any general psychophysical deterministic theory. Well, it just might be possible to test it, in which case, of course, we would show whether it was deterministic, whether it all our intentions were determined or they weren't. But the practical difficulties of testing it are so enormous that I don't think that will ever be done. And therefore, it's rational to believe what seems to be the case. As I say, it does rather often seem to each of us that in the circumstances I've described, it's we who choose whether to yield to temptation or whether to do the best we think. And it's always rational to believe that things are as they seem to be in the absence of counter-evidence. And my argument is it's most unlikely we'll be in a position to get that counter-evidence. This is not conclusive. I think the argument against physical determinism is conclusive. This is a probabilistic argument, but I think it's very strong.